Welcome to Around the Empire. We have a live stream for you today, and we're going to talk about the Ukraine war. I think you know most people on this panel, but let's let everybody introduce themselves real quick. Maybe start with you, Dan, if you don't mind.
Dan Wright. You can hear me, right?
Yep.
Okay.
You're
Yeah,
good.
Dan Wright, Around the Empire, longtime listener and commenter. Check me out online at ESW_XYZ. Occasionally write about some stuff, but that's about it. Just annoying commenter. Can we go next, Kelley?
Kelley, and we have Kelley Lane.
Yes, hi, I'm Kelley. I am an occasional co-host that joins Around the Empire. I'm also an independent journalist myself, and I am editor and co-producer of Assange Countdown to Freedom. I do some election integrity work and so on. So I kind of dabble in a lot of things, and I've learned a lot from Joanne's show for years before I would join to chat. I would listen to her show, and I think it's great. She's got a great guests that come on. So I'm excited to meet Riley here.
Yeah, hey guys, my name is Riley Waggaman, and I go by the moniker Edward Slav Squat on Substack, and I primarily write about sort of Russia in relation to COVID and biosecurity, but because there's a war on, I also occasionally sometimes weigh in on the situation in Ukraine. And thank you so much for having me on. It's really, I'm so glad, Joanne, that we finally got to talk.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, we've been trying for a few months to find a way to, a day and a time and whatever. It's kind of funny that it ended up being sort of a last minute, well, not that last minute, but not a plan for many days things. So Dan and I are, and Kelley, we're all East Coast United States. And Riley, you're American or Canadian? But
I'm American.
American. And somewhere much closer to Ukraine than we are. I'm not sure exactly where you are.
Well, I spent the last. I lived in Russia for about 8 years, and currently I'm in Tbilisi, Georgia. So.
Oh, the other NATO battle zone.
Yeah. Exactly.
But still very plugged in with with everything that's going on in Russia from reading your Substack, I can tell. And well, obviously this war has been sort of feast or famine. In the beginning, it was impossible to get information other than just the flat out propaganda that some of it was obviously not true. Others, we had no way of really knowing what was going on. And now it seems to come in fits and starts. Like sometimes you get a whole bunch of it, and then it will just sort of the war itself. And I guess this is the way wars are anyway, right? They don't always move at a fast speed, but things are moving at a fast speed right now. And I'm pretty sure everyone has already been watching for, let's see, what is it? When did the Ukraine counteroffensive? Was that last weekend? It feels like longer ago, but I guess maybe it's only about 5 days ago. That Ukraine, after many months of frustration, didn't look like much success. Suddenly, very suddenly, launched a successful counteroffensive, 2 counteroffensives in 2 regions, not so successful. The other one, sort of a surprise in the, depending on how you pronounce it, Kharkov region, which is in the northeast of Ukraine. And they just cleared out a pretty big area. And now there are, there's sort of, I don't know if you could call them skirmishes, but there are problems all the way up to the border with Russia, since it's not very far from the border. And we still don't know how many troops were lost, but it was a sudden setback for Russia. There was a complete freakout, mostly from the pro-Russian side, who have been, very confident for a long time now. And then suddenly, it's almost like, and Riley, you can tell us this from what I'm hearing, and I've seen clips, even in Russian media, where you're not even allowed to call this a war. It has to be, a special military operation, and you're not allowed to criticize the military. You can actually be jailed for such things. But now there are actually open criticisms happening even in media, and not just from the people who have opposed this war. Even some of the people who have been staunchly pro-war have been, I don't know if it's severely critical or just frustrated or whatever. Calls for Putin to step down and stuff, which I didn't take seriously. And so now, and we'll go into more detail. I'm just kind of like throwing out a little bit of intro here, where it's a bit of a lull again, but not really. It's only been 5 days since this counter offensive, but Ukraine continues to try to break through down in the southeast, sort of just above Crimea in the Kherson area, with not much success. But what I heard, but they're continuing. Russia knocked out the power stations in a very large region, disabled the rail lines, which the military primarily uses for transportation. And then I heard that yesterday, they actually bombed a dam that was at the head of a large reservoir, which then caused a surge in the river where it disperses, and I guess knocked out some. And the purpose was to knock out some pontoon bridges where Ukraine was sort of setting up to try again at this counteroffensive. So that's pretty much what I know from now. I've heard big numbers of losses on the Ukraine side, not so big numbers on the Russian side, but I really never believed the numbers.
I don't believe the numbers, though. That's the problem.
I mean, if anybody knows about the Vietnam War, McNamara, the Secretary of Defense at the time, was constantly playing a numbers game, and not, those numbers were not accurate. So that's my sort of like laying out the intro. I'm eager to hear what you guys have heard, and I'm going to add Connor. Here comes Connor Freeman.
Hey, what's up, everybody?
Hey, Connor, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Great to see you, Joanne. What's up, Dan? Kelley? Riley, great to meet you.
Hi, very nice to meet you, Connor.
Yeah, glad you could
Connor,
join.
Yeah, me too. Connor, do me a
Always.
favor real quick. Do a quick intro.
Yeah, I'm
Please
Connor
up.
Freeman. I'm the assistant editor at the Libertarian Institute. I've been doing some more news writing these days for antiwar.com, and I co-host Conflicts of Interest with our mutual friend Kyle Anzalone, which is a great foreign policy podcast everybody should check out. We hosted it at both sites, the Institute and antiwar.com.
Yes.
Okay, so I just laid out a little bit of intro, information about what's happened in the past week in Ukraine, and now we're just sort of all bringing what we've heard, what we know, and what we think, and free-form discussion here.
Well, one
on
of the
this
things,
crazy war.
one of the first things that I noticed, I happened to be listening to a little bit of George Galloway's show on Saturday, I believe it was. And I first heard about this Russia trying to knock out the power in Ukraine on his show, and I don't know where it came from through him, and so I immediately went online and started looking in all Western media, and there was like a 4-hour delay, I think, before it was showing up anywhere that I could find, and I just thought, that in itself is problematic because why does it take so long for us to just get hard facts on stuff? We have to go and this is the reason I do listen to George Galloway or Afshin Rattansi, who are on RT America, because they are ahead of the game a lot of the time. Yet they're still labeled on Twitter as, even though both of them have been in the UK, they're labeled as Russia state-affiliated media. But I just wanted to point that out because that really kind of stuck out to me. I thought, well, where do we go to get just, up to a minute information? So
That's a
Twitter's
tricky
wild
question.
Twitter's wild because they went on this whole kick after the 2016 election during the Trump era about disinformation, and there was this big freak out about disinformation. We've got to crack down on disinformation. Famously, they suppressed whatever you think of the Hunter Biden story. Maybe it was suppressed. You weren't allowed to actually look at it. And I have to say, since the start of this war in Ukraine, it has been a fire hose of open disinformation from the pro-Ukraine side. I'm not saying they're always lying. I'm just saying it has been completely unrestricted. Twitter has not cracked down on anything. And it just, in my opinion, this is a complete side note, exposes their, quote, anti-disinformation policy as what it was, which is politics, 100%. And so, I mean, stuff that you saw in the beginning, like Kiev Independent, I don't even know who they are. Maybe they're backed by the U.S. Maybe it's, but like they're putting out crazy numbers. Like I said, Russia's already lost 50,000 dead in like the first month. It's like, how is this possible? And like they're just putting out, and there's no sort of crackdown on it. There's been somewhat of a crackdown on the pro-Russia accounts, which can be just as propagandistic. I'm not saying they're not, but there's been none on the pro-Ukraine. So when you go on and hear about this offensive or counteroffensive, and you're saying, well, it does look like maybe it was effective, the people who are saying it are so untrustworthy, you have no idea what to believe. And I don't know if this is the new information war to just muddy the waters so much that nobody knows what to believe, but that's been a big problem for me, is I just can't believe anything. And CNN and cable news have basically said, we're just going to parrot any talking point from the Ukrainian government. And in the Ukrainian government's defense, I guess, they're in a state of war. They don't have any compunction about throwing out false information if they think it's going to misdirect the enemy. So it's like, so that's just a general comment. Like there's been no skepticism, and all that anti-disinformation rending of garments that happened after the 2016 election has completely faded into nothing, because it's like, well, let Ukraine say whatever they want. My 2 cents.
I think there's no skepticism because even the infamous pro-Russian war nerds on Telegram admitted it and confirmed it. This
right.
This,
it's like, how do you know the wind's blowing? Right. How do you know the wind's blowing? You got to watch the leaves. So it's like, well, what do the pro-Russia people say? Well, they seem to be saying this isn't effective.
That's the way this war. Yeah.
Instead of getting
at
hard
least that's
news,
what What do you think, Riley? Since you're in the region and plugged into the Russian media and sources there, did you find it credible? Did you have any doubts about the Kharkiv? Because maybe I'm totally wrong here. Like, did it happen?
The power outages or what? Or just the...
Oh, sorry. No, the actual retaking of territory and the route. Yeah.
So look, I mean, I follow sort of like pro-Russian sources within Russia pretty closely. And what was really interesting to observe was that the real military hardliners in Russia were really disgusted by how slowly it took the Russian Ministry of Defense to actually issue a statement about what was going on in this. I mean, what ended up happening actually was that people were turning to Ukrainian sources, which were in some cases exaggerating what had actually taken place. And there was a huge amount of frustration within sort of pro-Russia circles about why aren't we receiving any information or, details about what is going on here. And, actually I just posted something about this on my Substack, where I just went through, there's a very, very popular Russian language sort of military portal called topwar.ru, and it's called Military Review. And these guys are very patriotic, very pro special military operation, very pro Putin. But if you go back and read what they've been saying over the last, like from the start of July, they've been saying this, that the Russian Ministry of Defense has been exaggerating how much Ukrainian armor has been destroyed, which is creating a false sense of security. They've been warning that this operational pause in East Ukraine was allowing Ukraine to sort of consolidate forces and potentially launch a counter-offensive. They were saying that the Donbass militias were criminally under-equipped, and that they hadn't had any time to go home to their families since the start of this conflict. There'd been no rotation. And you go and you look at how they responded to this counteroffensive, and they said, look, just don't lie to us. Just be on the level with the Russian people. We deserve to know the truth. And I would say, look, I'm not a military analyst. I don't know what's going to happen next. Maybe in the next week, all of the territory that Russia lost will be reclaimed. That's possible. I don't know. The problem, though, the real problem here is that a lot of Ukrainians who started viewing the Russian forces as liberators, or decided that, yeah, okay, we'll be part of Russia, were abandoned. And now they're at the mercy of the SBU, which is the most vicious, disgusting, backwards, spook organization on earth. And it's very, very demoralizing. And I can't stress this enough, how it's very, very upsetting for, especially from the pro-Russia side, to see this happening. Because why should the Russians expect Ukrainians to cooperate with them if they can't even guarantee the security of civilians who view the Russians as their liberators, or get Russian IDs while they're living in some Kharkiv region? And so this is really the big issue, and it's being talked about openly now in Russian language media.
Yeah, Dima from Military Summary Channel, that was the first thing that he thought of, and he expressed similar anger and concerns, because the Russian troops that were there were telling them they were there for good. And I don't know what the Russian officials were saying, but I assume it was a similar message. And so what are you supposed to do if you're a person who lives in one of the regions? Maybe you're not even particularly lean to either side, but you're just trying to survive, right? So, and then if you cooperate and then, the territory changes, then you get punished for it. It's not fair. It's just not fair. Most people are just trying to survive. They're not well, I don't know this firsthand, but logic, they're it's not like they conspire to be a collaborator or had a burning desire to be one, right? I would think that most people are going to be like me, and they're just going to put their families, is the number one thing, and survival. Anyway, end of rant.
I think one of the main issues that Doug McGregor has talked about is that they did not make it clear, especially in the first several phases of the war, that they were going to be there indefinitely, or that they were going to truly take territory and then occupy it and protect it, for the foreseeable. That basically that they were under the understanding that it was this special military operation, that it was a temporary thing, that they were going in to demilitarize and denazify and protect the independence of these Donbass republics. And so, especially when you have so many people east of the Dnieper that would support the Russians, they were all very reluctant to actually go ahead and express that or make that clear at all, for fear of reprisals from the Ukrainian side. And then I know he's also said that he estimates that the Ukrainian casualties, and this is maybe a month or two ago, I remember him saying on the Scott Horton show that and I know I agree with you that it's tough to find out clear numbers from either side in terms of casualties. But I have heard this. There was another article about this at the Ron Paul Institute a couple months back, that the estimates of of military casualties on the Ukrainian side is somewhere between 60 and 70,000. And again, I mean, the fact that McGregor endorsed that it adds some credibility to it to me, because I don't think he would just say that.
Killed in action, Connor, or hurt? Casualties meaning they're
like killed in action.
Oh, okay.
And it is pretty shocking when you see that the British are, they're shipping out, the Ukrainians are shipping out, like the British want to train 10,000 troops in 120 days. And if you read and there's a bunch of NATO forces out there from these other countries that are training them as well. I believe Norway's down there as well. And if you read what the commanders in charge of these British commanders are describing the training as, they say it's a condensed form of the British infantry training. And there's a quote in there where he goes, "We're teaching them how to shoot well." And it's very disturbing because, as you know, that they've banned men from 18 to 60 to leave the country. So you have to imagine, I mean, with the conscription going, how many people have actually died, and are people, they're probably just conscripting largely civilians at this point to fight this war. And we keep hearing from Austin and all these other people, particularly Austin at that meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany recently, where he kept saying long haul, like it had been given to him in notes and bullet points. And he says, we're going to be integrating training for the long haul. We're going to be integrating joint capabilities for the long haul. And basically saying, again, that we're carrying out the bilateral process with NATO involvement under this NATO umbrella, like how they're saying now they want these security guarantees. The Ukrainians are that they're carrying out the NATO expansion in Ukraine just without making it official. So every single thing that we have done to provoke the war, they're just doubling down on now. And we know with one of the recent arms packages, it was largely done under the Ukrainian foreign, the Foreign Assistance Initiative. It wasn't the PDA. It wasn't the Presidential Drawdown Authority. So they're signing on contracts or developing contracts right now with the military industrial complex for weapon systems that won't even see the battlefield for 2 or 3 years in some cases. So it's just, the fact that they want this thing to keep going and going and going. As said in your Substack, Riley, that there's concerns that dragging on the Russian side, that dragging the war out doesn't benefit Russia, and I could see that argument too. I think that it looks like it's going to destroy so much of the country. Even when they expanded in the Northeast to the border near Belgorod, where people were evacuating, they had to evacuate a village because allegedly there was shelling coming over the border. We have seen attacks going on, and some Ukrainian intelligence officials have bragged about it in the media, that they go over and they do these. This is a separate thing, but just the fact that we're going to see more attacks in Russian territory over the border, which makes total sense. But it just seems like things are escalating at this really alarming rate, even for this war. And I'll just point out that there is talk. Have you guys seen about this idea that, how they said that when they went to Kiev originally in the war, when the Russians did, and then they pulled back from Chernihiv and Kiev, that it was a feint, that they're now suggesting that the Ukrainians could have done a feint in Kherson, where they thought the Russians thought we should go reinforce down in the south north of Crimea here. And it sounded like there's some of these, the Washington Post interviewed some of these soldiers in a hospital, Ukrainian soldiers, and they were saying we were outnumbered 8-1, and we're rationing our artillery. We can't even, the stuff we have, we can't even aim. And for every one Russian troop that we get or that we kill, they kill 5 of ours. And meanwhile, it sounded like I misspoke. That they said that it was like for every one person they killed, they got 5 of theirs died. But in the Northeast near Kharkiv, I think the Russians were outnumbered 8-1. So it looks like that they had their forces unprepared for this offensive, and now I don't know. The Russians, it sounded like they're still reluctant to actually acknowledge in any sort of an honest way what happened, and they're just sort of suggesting that, well, we're pivoting back towards the Donbass and we meant to do it like this, so you never know. But also I just keep an eye on all these attacks that are going on in Crimea as well, because in the last couple of months there have been more and more sabotage attacks. The Ukrainians threatened to kill a bunch of civilians down there, Russian tourists, and then I think it was the Ukrainian chief of staff who recently said, yep, that was us, in some op-ed he wrote with a Ukrainian lawmaker. So and now I guess they're saying they want a multi-decade support with all this same stuff of arming and integrating with NATO countries. Is the new.
But how many troops? This is a question. I've seen one analysis that says basically these people they're drafting off the street, the territorial defense, whatever. are kind of being used as cannon fodder, and they're protecting the sort of professional troops, the SBU, whatever. And so I'm just wondering, 10 million people have already fled Ukraine since it started in 2014, I guess after the Maidan coup, revolution, whatever you want to say. Isn't there a limit to Ukraine's forces? I mean, I know we're sending mercenaries in there, and there's a lot of people on video with American accents marching around in Ukraine that I can clearly recognize their accents. And there's British mercs there too, people, or at least maybe official soldiers, we don't know. But isn't there a limit to how many casualties Ukraine can take? I mean, it's not the biggest country when you consider how many people have already fled, and we're propping up their government. We're literally, we being the United States, are literally paying the bills for the Ukrainian government. Because they're broken. They can't collect taxes. They can't even, it looks like they're not even planning the harvest. So if we ever, that's why people say, well, the U.S. isn't even a main combatant in this war. And I say, that's complete nonsense. If the U.S. backed off today, that's it. Ukraine would have to make a peace deal, which we now know they were in the midst of doing in April before the United States and Boris Johnson, of all people, sabotaged it. This is from Fiona Hill, by the way.
Yeah.
Who that is.
Foreign Affairs.
That was one of the people who quote unquote, blew the whistle on Trump for not doing enough for Ukraine, or politicizing Ukraine aid, whatever that means. She's the one who said, we had a deal going in April. And so my only question is, doesn't Ukraine have a breaking point? Everyone's been hyper-focused on Russia having a breaking point, but doesn't Ukraine have a breaking point? Aren't they eventually going to run out of people if 10 million people have fled and they're taking 60 to 70,000 KIA and killed in action? That's my sort of open question. I don't know the answer. It's kind of a question like, isn't Ukraine eventually going to run out of people? Anybody know?
I'll just say really quick about the forces that are already on the ground from these NATO countries. The Times had that piece about American special operators who are retired, who are at the front lines training Ukrainian forces and preparing battle plans. So that could be some of these guys with these English American accents. And they did admit in another article in the New York Times that the CIA is mostly in Kiev. Sending all this intelligence to the Ukrainians in the front lines. They just said that before this offensive in Kharkiv, they really escalated the intelligence sharing the U.S. did with Ukraine. But they do admit in the Times that NATO special forces from Lithuania, Canada, France, and England are there. I know we knew about the SAS guys training them on anti-tank missiles back, earlier on in the war. But yeah, I who knows? I mean, it clearly the incentive is to keep it going, especially on the American side. And I don't know, maybe on the Russian side, they think that it's to their advantage to wind them down. But yeah, if you're just going to continue to send in all this weaponry to the point where they say the Pentagon stocks are uncomfortably low, and then you have this totalitarian system where they can just conscript people and prevent all these. I mean, I was writing stuff about what was going on in the Zaporizhia power plant. It was just devastating reading in the Post about how these families, women and girls, are moving to Poland and Germany because they're concerned of a new Chernobyl scenario, and their husbands are just like, bye, hope I see you again before this is over. So, I mean, I don't know. I would imagine, I don't think that the people that really want this war to keep going, like the Johnsons and the Liz Trusses and the Bidens and the Sullivans of the world, I don't think I guess they're going to find out if there is a breaking point on the Ukraine side.
Yeah, the one thing I can take away from this offensive, no matter how successful it is or unsuccessful is, this means the war will continue. Even this, that's the only real takeaway to my mind, which is this isn't a total victory. Russia didn't completely lose. They lost territory, but they're not going to give up. And now Ukraine feels like they've had some symbolic, if not real, victory. They're not going to give up. So we're just, in my opinion, just further down the line of an escalation to which could easily end in nuclear exchange. I mean, let's say the Ukrainians have let's say they have a series of breakthroughs and they're ready to invade Crimea or cross the border into Russia. Putin will launch nuclear weapons, which they've already changed their doctrine. I mean, this happened years ago. They changed their doctrine to be able to sort of do short-range nuclear attacks. So it seems to me we're just going, this offensive, all it achieved was encouraging the Ukrainians and the Russians to just not pursue a peace deal. And maybe I'm wrong on that. If anybody else wants to weigh in, and Patrick, also you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, no worries. I'm Patrick McKay from Wisconsin. I'm the Justin Raimondo Fellow at the Libertarian Institute. And, I've written in the past about this Josh Rogan had a piece, an op-ed that he published a few weeks ago that I think I mentioned or had written about, talking about kind of admonishing these populist conservatives for being, pro-Taiwan but not being pro-Ukraine at the same time. And Connor Eccles had a piece out, a former panelist here on the show, had a piece out August 29th talking about how Pentagon stockpiles are uncomfortably low. And the point of this Josh Rogan piece was talking about how, yes, indeed, the skeptics are wrong. The United States can confront Russia and China at the same time. And, we're talking about all of this escalation and the counteroffensive in Ukraine. And I can't even conceive of how the United States plans to confront Russia and China at the same time. Their stockpiles are so low. We haven't even been supporting Ukraine for 6 months. And maybe I'm underestimating the military-industrial complex's ability to fire up, the factories and to just go into a boon. Of course, we have the CHIPS Act coming out with Taiwan in an effort to become more independent, or at least to encourage Taiwanese chip manufacturing in the United States, it seems like. But I'm just kind of sitting here shaking my head if, we have U.S. officials talking about supporting Ukraine for the long haul. How do they plan on confronting both Russia and China at the same time? And, of course, we do have that multi-billion-dollar weapons package going to Ukraine that I think was just passed. So that's just my 2 cents about the situation, especially, with more some success being seen by the Ukrainian military.
Are you talking about the short-term spending package, the one that is COVID, monkeypox, and then 14 almost or 13.7 for Ukraine and allies in the region and to replenish American stocks? That passed.
I was talking about there was a Taiwan military package that was.
Yeah.
There's another one. That other
They're sending it to the Senate, right? The Taiwan Policy Act.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah, and they increased it 6.5 billion now instead of, was it 4.5 earlier? And they're extending the length of aid.
I got to find the write-up.
Yeah, Rogan says in that piece, it's so fascinating because he's just. I'd be reluctant to call him right or left. He's just Bill Kristol's protege at the Washington Post for the most part, and he comes out and he goes, "Oh, Russia the American right. See, this is problem because the right hates China and the left hates Russia, but I hate them both, and I wish they hated them both. But thankfully, Congress, the House and the Senate support everything, escalating with China over Taiwan and sending all these delegations over there and escalating aid to Ukraine and continuing to fund the war there." So he's like basically going, we got a pretty good situation here. Even if the public isn't 100% on board, they're enough on board at this point for both of these coming, the great power competition, the new Cold War, which, as Dan was saying, I think we're really getting close now. It's arguably worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis in the sense that we don't even have Blinken and Lavrov talking. They did for 25 minutes, not about the war, and Blinken just made a bunch of threats, and if it did come up. And then, when is Biden ever going to... First of all, is Biden capable of talking to Putin? Who are we going to have talk to Putin?
I think it's just astonishing to me that, I see, at least on social media, there's a lot more resistance, among the public. I've seen a lot recently, like, we can't... somewhere in Mississippi has a water crisis now, too. And, of course, we have Flint still. And the public, sentiment about not spending money at home and just continuously funding these bills for more weapons. It's like they don't care. We've got, is it Sheehan and Cornyn? I was reading, I guess this is just the Securing American Arms Act. That's just the replenishing, right, of what we've depleted, I guess, of our own. But they just keep going. These Congress people, it's like everything. There's this Princeton study that showed that, no matter what the people want, we get 30% of what we actually want, because Congress is just doing whatever they want. They don't listen. So it's just astonishing to me that continues.
Every week there's a new package rolling out. I just saw a headline that they're expediting the next preparation of the next package to send something to Ukraine. I've lost track of the whole funding and supplying stuff.
Well, they should,
I'd love to track down how many rounds of artillery we've sent, because I mean, you've seen some of these packages where it's like 336,000 rounds in just one thing, and there's a bunch of them, and so I'm not surprised that we're running low on particularly.
But
they
that
said
just
specifically on
justifies
artillery.
buying more, right? That just justifies buying more. They get to export, and then they get this thing. It's a crisis. We don't have enough, and so then they can pump more. I mean, the U.S. has basically become like a tax farm for the sort of transnational arms dealers. I mean, we're just like, we just pay taxes and nothing. The roads kind of suck, and the bridges suck, and there's no real healthcare system. All this money just gets sucked into this sort of transnational money laundering. And I said, man, what are they going to do after the war in Afghanistan ends? And they can't launder billions of tax dollars through there into the D.C. suburbs through arms contracts. Oh, here we go. Here's Ukraine.
Well, I think
it's like the beast. The beast must keep eating somehow, and it found a new meal.
I think we are going to see higher turnout on the midterms this year because of this, obviously. I mean, because the public sentiment is really not for this war. So, yeah.
They're also, I think somebody already mentioned this, looking for ways to fire up the factories again. I think to make more mortar shells or artillery shells, and maybe rockets for the HIMARS. I don't know, but that's the next thing. I mean, I thought what is it, about $1.25 trillion is what we like really spend on military stuff, and it's not all in the defense budget. It's elsewhere throughout the budget too. So I thought those factories would be running, like a lot of them running multiple shifts, but you telling me they're not? Like, where is this $1 trillion going? But anyway, yeah, they want to fire up the factories again, and sort of a lot of this language from World War II is popping up again about
Defense production.
Industrial power,
I was
and
gonna
the
say,
industrial factor in a war, whatever. It's
are we going to bring back like Rosie the Riveter? Oh,
I read your
Watch
mind.
Biden do this. He's going to bring back the Defense Production Act, like Truman, and they're going to do like they were talking about this in COVID, and liberals got on board for it. They're going to, I mean, maybe that's the idea. I mean, they're going to do a massive public works project, and it'll be the new Cold War, the New Deal, the new Cold War. I mean, and also I think it's actually more than 1.25. Robert Higgs always used to say that you multiply the defense budget by 2, and we're getting close to $900 billion at this point. And every time Biden requests some number we've never seen before, Congress says it's not enough. We have to take on China. What are you kidding? They're going to eat our lunch. And and the thing, I think what's really problematic is I agree that we see all this anti-war sentiment now, but basically if the MAGA right is so ass backwards on China, just purely, I'm only speaking even just about the military confrontation, the coming military confrontation, the trade and all and these other things. There's more nuance to that, but they don't acknowledge the Asia pivot and this situation with Taiwan and how close we're getting to a war with China. So they just support it because they think Biden is in his pocket. We even have libertarians talking about Joe Biden this way now, the National Party account. And then they just rely, I think, basically on the MAGA right being propagandized sufficiently, and the liberals, of course, will support absolutely any war, it seems like, at this point.
Also, I think and maybe Riley can weigh in on this, because I see he has a post about, how does this end? It seems like with the U.S., what people can seem to appreciate is like, this is, situation normal, all effed up. Like, this is how we behave. Like, we have a huge arms industry that is constantly looking for reasons to run the presses or run the machinery to build weapons. So for us, like, there's no reason to end this war. We don't, like, for us, this is good. This is a stimulus. This is like business development. But for people in the region who are actually underneath this ordinance we're shipping over there, how does this end? What is the end game? We knew in April there was supposed to be some compromise, but what the hell do we do now that there's been a successful counteroffensive or marginally successful when both sides now have no reason to make a deal? Because Russia doesn't want to look weak and Ukraine thinks they're winning. So take that on, Riley. Go ahead, solve this crisis for us.
Jeez. Look, I mean, I'll tell you. So I was in Russia on February 24th, and I have relatives through marriage who are Russian, and everyone was crowded around the television set, and everyone thought this would be over in a week. And it's hard to remember, but go back 6 months, there were like Kiev was semi-encircled, and there was this real belief that this thing would be over very quickly, that there would be some sort of capitulation from, Zelensky would flee. Maybe he did flee to Poland and came back. We'll never know. It didn't happen. And what we've seen over the last 6 months is that we went from, Russia's going for the jugular in Kiev to Russia's going for Odessa, but that never turned out, to Russia's going for Kharkiv and it never turned out. And the problem that, no matter whoever you think is right or wrong, I just, put that to the side and just think like I asked, like, how does this end? Like, what possible victory terms can there be for Russia? And is Ukraine ever going to stop? Like, why would they at this point? And it's very, very scary to think about, because if you're in the Team Z camp, every day that this war goes on is a tragedy, because the whole idea here was that you wanted to wrestle Ukraine away from sort of NATO or the Western orbit, and you thought that at the very least Ukraine should be neutral at the very least, and that Ukraine should never be allowed to be an anti-Russia, which is basically what Putin said on the morning of February 24th when they sent tanks in. How does this happen now? I don't want to talk even about territory. Like, how does this actually happen where we have a situation where Ukraine is neutral now? Even if you sign a piece of paper, how does Ukraine become actually a neutral? There's going to be, I'm so afraid that we are witnessing the creation of generational hatred. And, the reality is Ukraine has never been more militarized, ever. You go back to 2014, Ukraine had, I don't know, like less than 10,000 active troops who could have done it. That's why they were so reliant on these, scumbag right-wing neo-Nazis, like punitive battalions, to like go east. They had no real military. What about denazification? The worst elements of the Ukrainian political, whatever you want to call it, society has been galvanized by this. It's illegal they made pro-Russia parties, they outlawed them. You can't even advocate for normal relations with Russia anymore in Ukraine. Go back to October, November 2021. Zelensky had something like 30% approval rating. There's a recent poll out. He's like 90%. 90% approval rating. And okay, maybe the poll numbers are all skewed, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, this is the problem that we're facing now, is that I think that plan A for Russia failed. And now there's no military solution. There's no military solution to this problem, because it's way, way more profound than just taking a city by military means, And so it's frightening. It's really scary. And I'll tell you honestly, as someone who, has lived in Russia, I'm telling you guys on the level that I think that Russians were not expecting this. Obviously, they support, their soldiers. They understand what has happened in Donbass, but it's sort of the situation where everyone's up against the wall. The Russians are against the wall. The Ukrainians are against the wall. Obviously, Washington and its stooges are aggravating the situation in horrendous ways. But again, it's like, how do the proles end up winning this one, right? Like, we're just the plebs, the plebes, right? Like, how do we come out on top of this one? And this is what has been driving me crazy over the last few months, because I keep seeing everyone saying, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. Well, like, who's we and like, who's winning? And I don't know, guys. So anyway, sorry for being such a doomer, but that's my take.
No, I think that's actually kind of a wind of sanity there, which is, you're right. When you look at, if the culture breaks down and there's a sort of new perception, which is what the Ukrainian nationalists always wanted. They always wanted this. That's why I said, that's why Putin's, I think, cynical opportunism when he talks about Nazism in Ukraine, which has always been there. I've said this before, I'll say it again. They're not neo-Nazis. Their parents were Nazis. Their grandparents fought with the Third Reich. There's nothing neo. When you see these guys get killed, the Azov battalion, you see pictures of them, and behind them there's like the Wolf's Angel or some Galatian SS unit. But this war has empowered them. They were marginalized. I mean, they weren't completely marginalized, but they had, because of the history of Ukraine and Stepan Bandera. But this has made them heroes. There's people celebrating Azov. They're the heroes of Mariupol or all that. Like, so Putin's goal was to denazify Ukraine. All he's done is pumped up. And let's be clear, this reminds me of Syria a little bit. Because one of the things President Obama finally admitted to, I think it was Thomas Freeman in the New York Times, he said, the idea that these middle-class liberals were going to be fighting a civil war was a pure fantasy. Like, yeah, no kidding. Those people fled Syria as soon as it started. Well, guess what? That's that millions of people who fled west are all the educated liberal class people. That's who left. So who's left when those people leave? The hardline zealots and people who want to take a chance to shoot a Russian who they consider whatever inferior or whatever. So if Putin's goal was to denazify Ukraine, I think it's done the complete opposite.
I want to ask Riley, how is Biden and his government's foreign policy in particular perceived in Russia by regular Russians? And also, I'm just curious, would you say that, like, describe to me as well, if you know more on this, like how perceptions of the situation in Ukraine changed over the course of last year as NATO exercises within the borders of Ukraine and in the Black Sea continued to rapidly increase, where I think we saw some unprecedented drills and things that we hadn't seen before, where you have Ukraine hosting like Rapid Trident 21 and exercises like this, like Sea Breeze in the Black Sea. And what were regular Russians thinking during that time, and how did they perceive Biden?
Well, look, if you're asking an average Russian about the Biden administration or even how U.S. politics works, they'll have no idea. They'll give you some, at best, they'll give you some boilerplate statement that they saw on TV. And it's the exact same if you're talking to an American and say like, hey, like, tell me about how the Russian government works. If best case scenario, they can name like Putin and maybe Lavrov, right? Like there's no actual, they're working just from like little crumbs that are fed to them, What I would say though is that there was obviously a huge shift, and you could feel it, where they felt that Trump, whether they were right or not, they felt that Trump represented, okay, maybe there'll be some reapproachment here. Maybe, we can be friends. And when Biden came in, there was this realization that things have gone wrong, and obviously with, Russiagate, the Russian media had a field day with this, because they're like, how could anyone think that we were behind Trump? I mean, you could talk for hours about this from the Russian angle, because it's like, look, I love Russia a lot, but the Russian government is totally incompetent. So it's like this idea that they have a puppet president in the White House is like, for average Russian, it's like a joke, It's like they can't even, half the time, like half the expenditures to build a road just like vanishes overnight, and yet somehow they got Trump into the White House. I mean, it's not a serious proposition anyway. But to the second point of your question, I mean, again, this is another thing though that I think that it's hard for I think a lot of Westerners to think about Ukraine in ways that aren't necessarily about NATO. Like if you go back and read like what Putin put out this essay, I think it was like August or summer 2021, where he basically wrote this big essay and was like, I consider like like Ukraine is part of our historical lands, and we should never allow it to be used against Russia. And we're like one brotherly nation. And there was very, very similar rhetoric coming out in the earliest days of this conflict from state media. In fact, there was a very, very famous or sort of like infamous example of this. I think it was published by RIA Novosti, so Russian state media. And it was this long op-ed saying, this is the beginning of the reunification of the Slavic lands. We are all brothers, like Belarus, Ukraine, Russia. We'll never let the West divide us again. And the op-ed was pulled like within like 6. It was almost sort of like they accidentally like posted the victory speech, you know. And this is the thing though. It's like I think that people, a lot of Westerners, they don't think about it in that way. They think it's all about NATO. But look, NATO's expanding to Finland and Sweden, and Russia doesn't care. And why is that? It's because Ukraine has historical, cultural significance to Russia. And you know, the things that have been happening in Ukraine over the last, you know, you could trace it back decades basically, has like actual like it's a threat to like from Moscow's position. It's a threat to like the Russian being, you know. It's like this is like the heart of our civilization, and it's being torn away from us, you know, by the West. But it's not about that. It's about there's a larger picture here, you know. And so I would urge people to think like, yes, of course, NATO is like is pulling strings here, but the larger picture here is whether it was NATO or someone else. There's like it's a real tragedy. It's a real tragedy what we're witnessing, because every 10th Russian at least, I think it's like, has relatives, you know, in Ukraine. And so we're seeing, you know, in real time, we're seeing these two, you know, what we're supposed to be brotherly nations being torn apart. And I guarantee you that a lot of Russians, when they're watching the news on TV, are not thinking about NATO. They're thinking about how Ukraine will never be a brotherly state again, you know? And this is what there's like such a deeper cultural problem here that's going on. Like not even a problem, like a tragedy. Yeah.
In the U.S. propaganda mill, one of the things that I didn't know a lot about the personal relations or animosity or whatever. One of the two talking points you'll see is like the Soviet Union. This is re-Sovietization, and we have nothing to do with that. And I was like, well, wasn't Khrushchev from Ukraine? Wasn't president? But it's like okay. But then they keep saying like the orcs are coming. The orcs are coming, and I'm like, I didn't know what that. I thought that was maybe a Slav, and then I realized they're talking about like Lord of the Rings, which has been to do with racial brotherly. But they really do dehumanize and see this as like this invading sort of monstrous army that's I mean it's I mean, if you're looking for generational hatred or ethnic hatred, I mean a lot of that sounds like how you get there. And it's also interesting that everyone in DC, I mean everyone, dismissed the Kiev Rus essay or whatever that was from Putin, that he was completely manufacturing this out of thin air. He was completely lying, that this was a KGB pretext. But there probably at least was some truth to that. But then again, this war has definitely, I agree with you, blown that apart. And now you have, I mean, the mainstream accounts, by the way, I mean, official news agencies and people that work there talking about orcs, and we're going to drive back the orcs. That doesn't sound very brotherly or fraternal.
And then, and of course, there's a flip side too. The Ukrainians are the Ukrops, and they demean and belittle them and laugh at the huge numbers of casualties. Really, really nasty on both sides. Which, you know, as Riley said, that's why we worry about this being a lasting, I don't know, what kind of war, generational, just or whatever you call it. I was listening to cast, some live in touch base with their friends, and they said that, you know, we were told that there was like an 80% support of Russians, of, you know, average all Russian population for this war, but that's crumbling a little bit now. I guess it gave an opening, what this person's opinion was. It gave an opening for people who are opposed this war, this special military operation, to speak out. And personally, I don't know if there's anything to this, Riley. It's just my own sense, or what I thought I was watching as this has played out, and that is that I felt like there were all kinds of signs that this is still about the breakup of the USSR is still not resolved. Just many, many unresolved issues. I always thought it was amazingly peaceful and such. Of course, I'm far away from there, but I just thought there's some underlying things that are not worked out. I mean, it's the kind of thing that could take, God only knows, centuries to work out. People still battle over things like this. But when, one last thing is, when Zelensky did that big without you quote, I mean, a lot of people were really knocked for a loop by that, because it's the absolute opposite of this brotherly, we're all the same. We should always work together. We should always be together. Zelensky saying for anybody who didn't hear about this, this is right after Russia knocked out the power station. So the power was out. It was dark. The rail lines were down. The cell phone lines were down, and and there was water contamination. They blew up this dam, but I think there were other reasons why there was no water, maybe because no electricity. And so he's basically saying, it doesn't read out loud very well, but he says he's posing a question of a choice: without gas or without you being Russia. And and he chooses without you. And he says, without light or without you, without you, without water or without you, without you, without food or without you, without you. He says, cold, hunger, darkness, and thirst aren't as scary and deadly as your friendship and brotherhood. I was like, wow, they just smashed that to smithereens. Or so it seemed.
I'm sure a lot of American liberals retweeted that on 9/11. Nice 9/11 tweet for everybody.
Is that popular sentiment, though? Oh, I'm sorry, Connor. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, when you see Zelensky's statements and all these Ukrainian nationalists, I know they're emboldened. We talked about the 90% approval rating, but I wonder if that really is. I mean, this is why people in 2014 called it a coup. It's because Yanukovych, who was a corrupt guy, I have no sympathy for that dude. I think he was convicted of some assault charge, perhaps sexual assault. I don't want to go. I don't know that for a fact, but his base of support. If you looked at a voting map, and I was looking at these, in an election that was free and fair, according to the OECD, there was international observers, he is polling, and he pulled support from East Ukraine. That was his power base, right? And then West Ukraine was not. And so he had this conflict, and it was West Ukrainians that overthrew him, because Kiev is in West Ukraine. And that's also where, of course, the sort of more neo-fascist, or not even neo, old group is, right? Wright sector they even took credit on video for being part of the Maidan stuff. So it seems like there was this big split in Ukraine already that the war would only exacerbate, right? Because you had already this, it wasn't like this division came out of nowhere. West Ukraine was much more pro-EU. You had a lot more ethnic Russians in the East. And so even before the current war, the overthrow of Yanukovych must have felt, if you were a voter in the East Ukraine, you must have felt like you got disenfranchised, right? Because they basically, it was like January 6th, except it worked. he fled to Russia. So I don't know, Riley, do you think that's, isn't there that division, or was before the war at least?
No, totally. Two really quick things. The Zelensky tweet is really ironic because there's still Russian gas flowing through Ukraine. Ukraine is still transiting Russian gas. And there's a really great Actually, I have it here. It's from, I don't know if you can find it in English, but on Russian language TASS, there's this great headline where it's Dmitry Peskov, who is the Kremlin spokesman. And the headline is Peskov, Ukraine calls Russia an aggressor, but itself accepts money from it for gas transit. Well, of course, okay, Peskov is right, but of course it works both ways. So it's like this is supposed to be an existential, an existential war for Russia and the future of Russia, and it's business as usual for Naftogaz, which is Ukraine's big, energy company, and for Gazprom, it's just business as usual for the oligarchs on both sides. They don't care. So, people are getting, vaporized on both sides, in Kharkiv or whatever, and they're still sending gas across Ukraine. And so the second thing I would say, I mean, that's like a whole other topic, but it's just like, for me, it's mind melting. But, the thing about there is another irony here, which is you go back to 2018 when the situation in East Ukraine was way more violent. You had what's his name, Zakharchenko, the prime minister of Donetsk, who was assassinated, right? Like in this bizarre bomb attack. Like he walked into a cafe and a bomb went off. And around this time, a few months later, Sergei Lavrov gave an interview in Russian media to Komsomolskaya Pravda, which is like sort of a pro-government tabloid. And the interviewer was like, we should invade Ukraine. Like, we have to stop the Nazis. And Lavrov responds, he gives such an incredible response. He's like, if we recognize the Donbass republics, if that would trigger a war with Ukraine, and that would mean that we would lose Ukraine forever. That was like literally his words verbatim. And I'm sorry, like I don't want to be the doomer here, but like this, it's the same concept applies to 2022. And just as it was said previously, the point here is like, okay, recognize the Donbass, protect it, separate it from Ukraine. They're now independent. Maybe we incorporate them into Russia. You're literally taking the most pro-Russia parts of Ukraine and incorporating them into Russia, which means anything that's left of Ukraine is going to be have the political leanings that these are the so-called this is the Ukrainian Reich or whatever you want to call it. Like you're basically creating the state that you allegedly oppose. You're cutting off the part that is in favor of Russia, and you're leaving the rest of the country to the people who hate Russia. And you're creating the anti-Russia by doing this. And Lavrov said this in 2018. He said, look, it's not so simple. You can't just cut this part out of Ukraine, because then Ukraine becomes completely anti-Russia. There's no balance here anymore. There's no parts of, and Crimea is already part of Russia now. That was obviously the big part of Ukraine that was like ethnically Russia and pro-Russia. Now the rest of Ukraine you're literally creating the anti-Russia. You're creating the thing that Putin said he went into Ukraine to stop. And this is what I think people need to realize. And like, this is why I think you see it more and more in pro-Russia and even pro-war media spaces in Russian media, where they're saying, we haven't even taken Donbass yet. We haven't even liberated Donbass yet. And it's September. And what now? We're going to mobilize? Is Russia going to mobilize? And are we going to occupy all of Ukraine? Like, how do we make Ukraine neutral? How do we accomplish what we said we wanted to accomplish?
Yeah, the answers are all scary. the potential solutions are all scary. Like all these headlines about, I think they might use nukes. Just headline after headline after headline. Tactical nukes. Yeah, but it's still a nuke. There's no definition of what tactical. There's no like numerical value that. Anyway.
Well, I guess the theory is they would just break Ukraine and destroy it to such a degree that it would become completely dysfunctional and worthless to the West. Beyond nuclear weapons aside, let's put that aside. Just like And this is what actually some of the analysts, the seemingly pro-Russia analysts, are saying. Like, why did these HIMARS or all these weapons? They should have bombed all the rail stations. They should have bombed all the highways. They shouldn't have had the infrastructure to move that equipment east to attack the Russians for this counteroffensive. Well, I mean, I guess it's definitely a failure based on what Riley said and what Putin said in terms of what he's trying to do. If he's trying to form a brotherhood or rebuild the Soviet Union, it's not going to do that. But if, I guess, failing that, you can just break the country into 1,000 pieces and say, well, it's not on our side, but it can't ever threaten us because it's just so dysfunctional. I remember people remember after World War II, they had the Morgenthau plan, where they said, what we're going to do to Germany after starting 2 world wars is we're just going to deindustrialize it, break it, and we'll never get to it. The Soviets loved it, but it didn't. Marshall obviously wanted to do something different. So maybe that's the backup, not nuclear weapons per se, just sort of think, well, all right, we can't have it, but we'll trash it to the point where the West can't have it either, which is bad for the people of Ukraine.
So Riley, you said something earlier. I wanted to ask more about sort of the average Russian sentiment about NATO and Finland and Sweden, that they weren't really worried about that. Can you elaborate on that more? Because I would think that they would see that as like a threat. I mean, and what's the perception of NATO? I mean, among like your average Russian, they understand that this is really NATO or really the U.S.
Look, I mean, the average Russian obviously understands that NATO has been encroaching since the fall of the Soviet Union towards their border. But Russians also know that they have a nuclear arsenal. And in the time when I arrived in Russia in 2013, so it's so funny because I arrived like right when the Ukraine crisis started, and I'm currently trying to get back into Russia, but it's like right when Ukraine goes totally insane, right? But so I've seen all of it. But when I was talking to Russians in 2014, I remember too specifically with the MH17 shoot down. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is obviously a provocation. Like, aren't you guys scared? Like they're going to try to start some big war. All my Russian friends were like, why are you so afraid? Like we could just literally vaporize the entire world if they ever tried to attack Russia. That's what an average Russian would tell you. They're like, well, we're not afraid. Like we're not too worried about that. That doesn't mean that they didn't think that, NATO is trash and that it's a gross, disgusting, arms extortion racket. But they weren't like cowering in fear of NATO because Russia's not going to be attacking Europe. So why should they care? It was more of an offensive idea. Sorry, I forget. Was there a second part of your question?
No, that's it. It's interesting you brought up MH17. I was going to ask more about that because I don't remember the details exactly of who exactly shot that down. I don't know if you want to go into that or not, or if it's a little off topic, but
no. Yeah, it is. It's a whole nother rabbit hole. Well, we have gone for almost an hour and 15 minutes, and I know everybody's got things to do and all that. So maybe we should start to think about wrapping this up. And we're gonna do live streams fairly regularly. So hopefully we can get together again. But any other burning issues that we really need to get out here before we wrap up the stream?
Well, I would like to ask, like, obviously, I think everyone should listen to Joanne's podcast and Riley, read your blog and Conflicts of Interest and Anti-War. You learned so much from all those, but where can the average person go to just get like not commentary, but just like what are the best places to go for this data on what's going on the ground? Because like I said, but I heard about the power outage from George Galloway, but where do you guys go? I thought that might be something interesting we could talk about, or tell viewers where you go to get the information. Anybody?
Well, I would
okay.
recommend. I would just say I'd recommend Kyle Anselm. My partner does a great service with the news roundups at the Libertarian Institute, and those are indispensable. And those are mostly news articles. I mean, it's not commentary. Now, granted, he's not like updating it throughout every during the day, but it gives a great rundown, region by region, of all the most important things you should be reading that day. And I know what you mean. Like, I'm not one of these people that stays on the wires all the time. And I probably sometimes I should, but a lot of that information changes constantly. I still read a lot of I always go to, of course, antiwar.com, like you said, but I'll check out like Al Jazeera and Reuters for sure. And you just have to be skeptical and judge things for yourself. And but yeah, I know what you mean. It's very difficult in terms of just raw news, getting things up to date. Twitter can help, but it was probably better back even a few years ago. But yeah, I empathize with the situation. I mean, the best you can do is basically, from what I've seen, is find people you trust, and then it might take a little while to get. I mean, those kinds of updates, but find people who have a good record, who are credible, and then just track them, and then see if you can find out what they're looking at, and then base it off of that. That's what I've done over the years.
Split the difference. I think we talked about this earlier, but which is look at some of the pro-Ukraine, look at some of the pro-Russia, especially people who are going to kind of put out that's where they're coming from. I trust those people a lot more who are admitting it. Like, some of the analysis, like Scott Ritter kind of tells you where he's coming from. I disagree with a lot of what he said, but okay, that's his take on it. Moon of Alabama, similar thing. I think Consortium News typically has a little bit more balanced, I think, rigorous perspective. The pro-Ukraine stuff, if you want to find the Ukrainian government's perspective, Washington Post, New York Times, some of that stuff is clearly, in my opinion, disinformation, like they're trying to mislead the Russians. Although the Washington Post does occasionally, did have a good story where people were kind of admitting that they felt a little hopeless. And then those people were immediately arrested by the Ukrainian government for giving that comment. So, I mean, keep in mind, I think that Ukraine is now in a kind of police state. I think that's also a fair critique of what's going on in Russia, but it's definitely a fair critique of what's going on in Ukraine. And so people are not giving it, honest information. But so the way I do it is I just look at what the pro-Ukrainian people are saying, what the pro-Russian people are saying, and then think, okay, what's the most likely outcome? And so, for example, like with this counteroffensive, initially some of the pro-Russian people were like, they didn't do anything, it didn't even happen. And I was like, well, I don't know if I believe that. And then suddenly they're slowly but surely. A lot of this breaking news stuff, Twitter is the worst for, because there are people who are actively, and I think in many cases these people are paid to put out completely false information. So Twitter's the worst place to get breaking news on this war. But over time, it'll kind of trickle in, like this counteroffensive. Oh, actually, it was successful. It trickled in. Even the pro-Russia sources will admit that. There's guys, Russia with the podcast or whatever, they're decent. But they show you where they're coming from. So that's the only way I can know how to do it. I don't have any one source that I trust or think is credible. And I agree with what Connor said. Look for people who have a track record.
Yeah, I think, well, I was actually meaning more like, like from The Wire, like where do you get the hard facts? Like where does Kyle go? Like I love his news roundup. But I think for anyone that's kind of maybe new to independent media, I mean, for all of us here, we're used to reading maybe Consortium News and antiwar.com and figuring it all out. But for people that are maybe kind of new to that and just turning off the corporate news, where I guess where's the original source? What are the most
Telegram is where almost all the information on this war is. It's not on Twitter. Twitter's crap, complete crap. It's on Telegram, but it's in several different languages. You have to do both sides. And there are these maps. There are these map sites. And embedded in the maps is all kinds of data. Something like UA, live, what is it? Live UA. I always get that mixed up. but it's not easy. There are some YouTube channels and some blogs, but I have pretty much ditched all my previous sources, people I've respected for years, because I don't. This is a whole different ball game, this war, for whatever reason.
I would just add, if people are interested in, for example, if you're reading Reuters, you can read like a Russian version of Reuters, which is sort of like Interfax, just interfax.ru. And they have like a live updated, they have a whole section just devoted to updates on Ukraine. I mean, you could even do TOS, but just read it in Russian. If you don't read Russian, I mean, honestly, Yandex or Google Translate does a really, really good job in general. There's actually a lot of, if you don't want to go hunting on Telegram, a lot of Russian media will have up to the minute updates, and of course it's going to be the Russian perspective, but it's good information. So
one other thing that I wanted to mention was most of my information comes from the pro-Russia side. So I was trying to balance that out. I was like, I got to add some. So I just went to, there's this podcast that the Telegraph does. And I thought, all right, I'll sit through this and I'll listen to that. There has been a noticeable change in how biased they are, how exaggerated they are. They're much, much more cautious now to be skeptical about information before accepting it, and this kind of thing. And I noticed that the Ukrainian government, during this last week's counteroffensive, they were actually warning people not to necessarily believe some of these super great news about that. They were actually cautioning people. So I don't know what happened, whether somebody set them straight or whether they realized how much credibility they were losing, but with these sensational, ridiculous propaganda stories or whatever. But I do find that the MSM, some of them anyway, and the Ukrainian, the very pro-Ukrainian side is much more credible now than they used to be, for what that's worth. Only very recently, like the last month. So maybe that's good news.
Good to know.
Yeah. Everybody want to please let everybody know how to follow your work, how to support you. Riley, want to start with you and then we'll go clockwise.
yeah, sure. I just write. I blog on Substack, edwardslavsquat.substack.com. I'm on Twitter and on Telegram. So yeah, come hang out with me on Substack.
You can follow me at libertarianinstitute.org and, as I said, antiwar.com, and listen to Conflicts of Interest with me and Kyle. And I'm on Twitter at Freeman's Mind 96. And the Institute is also on Substack these days as well. And we'll be expanding that here going forward. But thank you very much again. This is a pleasure, and I'd love to come back soon.
Great.
Hey, thanks as always for having me on. You can find my podcast, Liberty Weekly, at libertyweekly.net. You can also find my editorials at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org. You can support my work by signing up for my newsletter at libertyweekly.club. Connor and I have a spicy article coming out next week, and I'm working on another spicy article that will hopefully be out next week, so look forward to that.
We look forward to it too. Anyway, this is Around the Empire. You can find pretty much everything aroundtheempire.com. We're expanding to some new platforms other than just Rockfin and YouTube. We're in Odyssey now, Substack, Locals, Rumble. I think that's it. And I'm in the process of it. I have added some new ways to support the show too, which will be in the show notes. Dan, your turn.
You just find me crap posting on Twitter. DSW_XYZ. Really it.
For now, yeah.
For now, Kelley.
Okay, I will take the opportunity to say, maybe if we had Assange not in Belmarsh, we would have some, more reliable, straight information from WikiLeaks or something. I think John Pilger brought that up. So I will say, if you want to support what I'm doing right now, go to AssangeCountdownToFreedom.com/billboard, because Randy Credico has done something only Randy would do. And he's been driving around this billboard truck now for like, gosh, 6 weeks around DC, and it's fantastic, and it's got huge, sign of Assange and stuff about the First Amendment. And this is big news. Ben Cohen of Ben and Jerry's Ice Cream is matching all funds for the billboard. So it's really been making waves. So I got to ride around in it one day in August when he was first starting, and the guy that drives it's a good sport. So it might keep going. So if you want to support what I'm doing, I would say do that.
All right. Again, thanks so much, guys. Let's get together again soon. And
Thanks.
see you
for
later,
having me.
everybody.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Nice
Have
to
a great
see
day,
you
everybody.
all. Nice to
Thank
meet
you
you
again.
all.
You too.
Yeah, nice to meet you too. Take care.